Hi, and welcome to Experience Points by University XP. On Experience Points, we explore different ways we can learn from games. I'm your host, Dave Eng from Games-Based Learning by University XP. Find out more at universityxp.com. On today's episode, we'll learn from Dan White. Dan White serves as the CEO of Filament Games. He is an advocate for integrating gameplay and learning and holds a master's in education technology. He founded Filament Games with expertise in teaching, instructional design, and game development. He is incredibly passionate about learning games, sustainability, mindfulness, and transforming institutional education. Dan, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Many people may not know you. I definitely know you because I visited Filament Games before. I don't think we met one-on-one, but I wanted to spend some time talking about your origin story and Filament Games overall. So can you tell us about your journey from being a teacher and game developer to founding Filament Games? How did your experiences in education and gaming come together to shape your overall vision for the company?
Yeah, absolutely. So going back to the dawn of time, I was working at a supercomputing facility that had a National Science Foundation grant to investigate what it would look like to make a digital museum. And so we tried to engineer as many playful experiences into those digital spaces, but the technology was pretty crude. We were working in an engine called Active Worlds at the time. And so a lot of our time and energy just went into making basic things work. And yet despite that, we were using these spaces to teach concepts about genetics to middle school students. And it was, I think it surprised everybody how, not only how effective it was, but also how engaged the students were. And so that was an initial light bulb moment for me. I was thinking, well, if this is not very good, but it is, then imagine if it was actually good, like how powerful this technology, how compelling this technology could be in the services of learning sciences. So I went on to pursue a master's degree at University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I had the pleasure to work under some of the seminal authors in the games and learning space: James Paul G., Kurt Squire, Constance Steinkuhler, Rich Halverson, Erica Halverson, and just sort of steep and marinate in a lot of the rhetoric being produced by some of the best and brightest minds in game-based learning at the time, and still to this day. And while I was doing that to make ends meet, I was also working as a teacher, not as a traditional classroom teacher, but as a technology teacher. So I did have a classroom, but I wasn't teaching core subject areas. This was during summer school, and I was teaching things like Adobe Flash and macromedia tools, web design, video editing, AV, stuff like that. And I think the reason that teaching experience was so formative, even though it wasn't a formal K-12 classroom, is that it gave me a real appreciation for how challenging leading a class is. I think of a classroom full of students of any age, but particularly at the middle school level, which is a level that we have developed a lot of games for over the last 18 years. Basic classroom management, just keeping students engaged, keeping things relevant, addressing the fact that every single student that walks into your classroom that day has a different life experience behind them and had a different morning before they walked through your classroom. And there's just so many different things for an educator to be thinking about other than education itself. And that I think, if anything, reified this idea in my head that there was a place for learning games in the classroom and outside of the classroom, because it's so important that we give educators tools to do what they do best, which is know their students and know what each individual student needs, and have the bandwidth to be able to give those students what they need, as opposed to trying to do a one-size-fits-all curriculum.
Right. Wow, thanks, Dan. I did not know that about your background. I knew reading your bio about your study and your work at University of Wisconsin-Madison. I think I originally came to know about Filament Games through the GLS conference that was originally held at University of Wisconsin-Madison by Kurt Squire and Constance Steinkuhler. A couple things that stood out to me that I wanted to talk about. One, trying to explain to middle schoolers what DNA is originally brought me all the way back to. Do you remember the Mr. DNA character from Jurassic Park in 1993? I might be dating
Oh,
myself by
yes,
bringing up this reference. Yeah, that's
absolutely.
immediately what I
No,
thought
yeah.
about. That and the fact that it is, that's a complicated subject. I don't fully understand it as an adult, but I'm also not a geneticist. I can't imagine the process that you go through in having to explain a concept like that to middle schoolers. And I think that your background overall as an educator and someone that recognizes that what Filament Games does and games and games-based learning overall are tools. They're not a replacement for education. They're not a replacement for teaching. They're not a replacement for instruction, but they're a tool that other educators and instructors use. So, thank you for providing that. And my follow up question was the Mr. DNA icon from Jurassic Park, was that influential in how you designed that system explaining genetics?
No, actually, this was before that even happened, I think.
Oh,
Well,
okay.
now I'm actually wondering if I'm getting my dates wrong. So Jurassic Park goes, the first one was mid 90s, I want to
Yeah,
say.
93.
90s. 93. Okay. Okay. So I'm wrong. This would have been shortly after that.
Oh, okay.
So it should have, because it should have been fresh on my mind. But no, you're 100% right. These are
Mm,
all tools that should be in the educator's tool belt, not to replace any other tools in their belt, and certainly not to replace the educator themselves, but
mhm,
rather a tool with very unique affordances that other sorts of media, especially passive consumption oriented media like books and movies and audio, just
mhm,
don't have, right? Games by their very nature interactive. They're essentially experience engines. And
mhm,
by virtue of that, they can deliver a type of conceptual and a depth of conceptual understanding that is very difficult for students to get from those other mediums. But yeah, when we were tackling the
mhm,
subject of genetics at the time, a lot of our methodology or pedagogy, if you will,
mhm,
was a little bit more traditional because it was based off of that museum model.
mhm,
Whereas now, even you'll see museums trying to get more and more interactive, based on this idea that some of the best learning is really hands-on, where the learner has the opportunity to dive in and manipulate systems and experiment and see what happens. So more so inspired by the museum structure than by the clippy version of
mhm.
the DNA avatar from Jurassic Park.
Right.
But I think that maybe one thing that's relevant is that, Jurassic Park and Michael Crichton as an author in general
Mhm,
did a really terrific job of taking science concepts and science subjects that were otherwise mainly the purview of scientists,
mhm,
and figuring out how to make them interesting to the general public, to a gen ed audience. And that's also, I think, a big part of what games can do. Although, in his case, he's doing it for purely entertainment purposes, whereas a lot of the games that we develop, are intended to entertain, right? But they're intended to
mhm.
entertain by virtue of the player mastering the things that we want them to learn.
Right, right, right. Thank you, Dan. I appreciate it. I think as a good segue here, I know that referencing the movie Jurassic Park, Hammond, one of the original characters, talks about how paleontologists will basically become extinct because why go to a museum and see the bones of a dinosaur? We can actually experience a live dinosaur in real life, and that brings me to the second question here. When you talked about games as experience engines, when I was studying your biography and your background leading up to this interview, one of the phrases that really stood out to me was the phrase pleasing frustration. So I know you've talked about this phrase specifically in scaffolding in learning games, which sounds very intriguing, and I've never actually used this phrase before. So can you discuss what you mean by the term pleasing frustration? And how does your team strike the right balance between challenge and support to keep learners engaged and motivated throughout the games that you've produced?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is not at all unique to Filament, but I think a tool that game designers across the game development space use on a regular basis. Because the thing is, if a game is too easy, the players tend to get bored. So a lot of players, when they play video games, are looking for a challenge, but it has to be the right amount of challenge, right? It can't be too hard, it can't be too easy. You're trying to walk that fine line. And so I think the same is true for educational video games. A game that we've been working on for some number of years called RoboCo, which is a digital robotics game, is actually quite challenging. We ask the player to build robots to solve problems, and we try to make it start out as easy as possible, but and then ramp up at a pace that feels motivating. But part of making it feel motivating is making it feel a little bit frustrating, so that you want to win. Like, you want to feel like a sense of victory if you succeed, right? And in fact, the best moments in that game are the moments where you've tried a couple iterations of designs for your robot and you get one that solves the problem really elegantly. And you kind of feel like a genius in that moment where your robot completes the task at hand in a really intelligent way, in a really elegant way. And that is, in that moment, the player's brain is releasing a lot of dopamine, and it's well-earned dopamine, right? It's not gamification-based dopamine where there was something superficial that happened, like a reward, like a star. It's an earned reward. And I think the literature suggests that that is the type of positive feedback loop that actually leads to sustainable interest in learning outcomes and pursuing self-betterment, right? It's when you tackle something that is hard but fair and doable and get that dopamine rush because you've actually accomplished something meaningful, that really keeps you engaged long-term with something.
All right. Thanks, Dan. Some phrases that came to mind immediately when you're talking about this level of appropriate challenge is like the zone of proximal development, and getting players to engage in that flow state where they're at just the right level of challenge. Again, nothing too easy, nothing too hard, but at a point where they are sufficiently challenged to continue playing and engaging with the game. And again, I guess another pop culture reference, I guess I'll date myself again, is do you ever play the PC game The Incredible Machine? Do you remember that game?
Ooh, The Incredible Machine. Yeah, I have played that game. I haven't logged a lot of time with it, but I'm familiar with it.
So for those listeners who haven't played it before, The Incredible Machine, we'll spend some time talking about RoboCo in the next question, but it is basically creating a machine, but it's a Rube Goldberg machine. So the objective for each level might be to get this apple from one side of the screen to like a basket on the other side of the screen. But you're challenged to do so using only the elements that the quote unquote game provides you, like a piece of string or scissors or like a candle or anything else. And you need to figure out how to get that apple from one point to the other. But in the open sandbox version of the game, you can turn it into a Rube Goldberg machine, which is how many steps can I throw in the process of getting this apple from one side to the other. And it's kind of like, I suppose it's the opposite of RoboCo, where you're just not trying to find an efficient solution. You're just trying to find the longest, like craziest solution to do so. But I think it still speaks to that same like flow state and zone of proximal development, where you have this clear positive reinforcement of being able to achieve this challenge of either making something super simplistic or making something super long or like overly complex.
Right.
That I think is interesting, and I think that so long as the game achieves the specific learning outcome that you're focused on, particularly for RoboCo, which we'll talk about next, I think that's a positive experience, first of all, and that's a really positive gameful and game-based learning experience.
Yeah, and I think what makes it so compelling to a lot of players is that creative agency, right? And this is something that good games are particularly good at, and I dare say in direct contrast to a lot of formal learning experiences where you're asked to draw between the lines, as it were, whereas good games, I think in many cases, give you a lot of agency to solve the problem in a way that feels personal and meaningful and feels relevant to your own interests and experience and ideas. So, the Incredible Machine is a terrific example. In some ways, it's a canvas, and the pencil or the paintbrush in this case is all of the different machine parts that you have in order to move the ball from point A to point B. And that feels really good to have to have the agency as a player to come up with a design that suits that feels very personal. That feels something that it feels like something that you can have a high degree of ownership over. Across the last 18 years, we've definitely made games where the player has varying levels of agency all along the spectrum. We try to develop toward the high agency end of the spectrum because we feel like that's kind of the sweet spot from a learning experience perspective, and also just what makes for the best gameplay. Like, as I think back across my gaming careers, the best experiences that I had were games where I felt a high degree of ownership over the choices that I made and then the outcomes of those choices. Now, at the end of the day, all video games are constrained spaces, right? It's not the real world. You can't literally do anything that you want. And so you are, to a certain extent, always operating within certain parameters or certain constraints. But that's also important from a learning perspective as well, because if you completely open the floodgates, then the learner doesn't necessarily have the experience that you intend for them to have. So I think when we're designing good learning games, it's always about striking that balance between completely open-ended sandbox where no two learners have the same experience, and hyper restricted experience where we can guarantee what they'll learn, but they don't feel any sense of ownership and therefore have lower levels of engagement.
Right. Thanks, Dan. I know that agency is a particularly critical and important part for game-based learning. And you said the magic word, which is sandbox, which leads me into my third and next question there, which is RoboCo, which is, I believe, the latest game that Filament Games has produced, which is a sandbox game that encourages players to design and build robots for real-world scenarios. So can you tell us a little bit more about how the game aligns with educational standards like next generation science standards and Common Core? And then specifically, how does it promote problem solving and critical thinking skills?
Yeah, absolutely. So the game is basically, you can think of it like a robotics toolkit, but digital. So unlike with a physical kit, A, it's a lot more affordable. Those are very expensive. B, you have unlimited parts. C, you have parts that wouldn't be practical in the real world, either because they're too expensive or too dangerous. And D, you can prototype your creations really quickly. So when you're working with robots hands-on, the span of time between your idea and being able to test that idea and see it in action and see how it works can be days, in some cases weeks or more. And that's fine for a really motivated, more experienced roboticist, but for somebody who's just learning, it's very difficult to keep somebody engaged for that period of time before they get their first kind of win or sense of hitting that positive feedback loop. So that's a big part of what we're trying to do with the digital space, is decrease the cost and then decrease the amount of time from the point where a beginner roboticist starts their journey and has no idea what robotics is all about, why they should care, and the point where they've built something that has solved a problem that you could see a robot solving in the real world and feeling really good about their design solution. So RoboCo really focuses in pretty hard on the mechanical engineering aspect of robotics, although you can entirely program and automate your robots through sensors and Python. But the game, I think, is unique in that there are a number of other experiences that allow you to program and automate your robots, but there are not many other experiences that allow you to design and build the exact robot that you want. And the cool thing about that mechanical engineering aspect is that we hit a lot of the engineering design process standards really well. And the reason that these standards are so important is that, most novice engineers or roboticists take kind of a spaghetti at the wall approach, right? They don't have much of a methodology in the same way that somebody who's maybe asking a scientific question, but is not versed in or literate in the language of the scientific method, might take an unscientific approach to answering a question about the world. So the reason that rapid prototyping in digital space is so important is because we can scaffold the player from that spaghetti at the wall approach to engineering design to a much more thoughtful and planned out approach where they're making very intentional edits each time they iterate on their design.
All right. Thanks, Dan. I appreciate that. I think that iterative process of designing and engineering is incredibly important. Full disclosure, I haven't had the opportunity to play RoboCo yet. I have it on my Steam wish list, so hopefully I'll get to do that in the near future. But everything that you've discussed about it so far sounds very similar to like what Lego does with its serious play. And I originally started down a road of using Legos all the way back in high school for developing and surmounting some sort of engineering challenge. So can you talk about, like what would be the differences of an educator's looking at, using RoboCo as an educational tool and possibly using Lego Play as an educational tool? What would you say are the main differentiating factors between RoboCo and what, an educator would use with Legos?
Yeah, no, they're definitely similar in that,
Hmm.
they're open agency play spaces, they're sandbox spaces where
Hmm.
the player is bringing a lot of their creativity and problem solving and design thinking
Hmm.
into the space in order to come up with solutions that are entirely their own. I mean, one big difference is that we do provide, by virtue of it being a digital space, we
Hmm.
provide challenges for the player to build toward or solve, right? So
Hmm.
Lego is a true sandbox in that you can build whatever you want, but you don't necessarily have a particular reason to
Hmm.
build a thing, right? You
Right.
sort of have to invent that reason as well, unless you're participating in, say, for example, like a robotics competition,
Hmm.
where and using like a Lego Spike EV Spike Prime kit or something like that.
Hmm.
Roboco, by contrast, every player who plays RoboCo is given a campaign of compelling reasons to build different types of robots that have different types of functions, right?
Hmm.
So you might, one campaign level challenges you to build a robot that can deliver a sandwich to a customer at a
Hmm.
table in a bistro. Another one challenges you to cross a gap and turn a valve to stop a goo leak. Another
Hmm.
one challenges you to build a robot that can perform a particular set of dance moves, or to harvest lumber and place it in a truck, or to transport a box from a high shelf to another high shelf.
Right.
So like a really, or to catapult something from point A to point B. So really different types of engineering tasks that get the player thinking about different types of designs. We don't ever want the player to be able to recycle a design from a previous point in the campaign, because we
Hmm.
want each one to be a very differently shaped mechanical engineering challenge.
Right. Thanks, Dan. It sounds like you've really thought a lot about this process and are constantly innovating over there at Filament Games on how to create the best games-based learning, serious games, and apply games for teaching and learning. Which brings me into my last question here, which is about just overall your philosophy on innovation at Filament Games. So from you as a leader in the educational game development industry, how do you keep your team and projects at the forefront of innovation? And specifically, how do you ensure continuous improvement in your game designs and methodologies?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think so much of it is about pushing new platforms and new subject areas and new game mechanics. So
Mhm.
I'll start with platforms. So, when VR became a viable platform, we started exploring what the unique affordances of that platform were, and how we could leverage them in the service of learning through
Mhm.
interactive play. And of course, it turns out that VR is great for teaching, embodied concepts and subject areas.
Mhm.
Mechanics, we're constantly thinking about what types of gameplay mechanics or interactions or verbs would allow us to impart an experience to the player that they maybe can't have practically in any other
Mhm.
way in or out of the classroom. In terms of the subject areas, this is our first time making a game about robotics.
Mhm.
And so we have to ask ourselves, well, what do physical robotics kits do really well? And then what can we do in the digital space that you can't do with a physical robotics kit?
Mhm.
We're also thinking about, what does it look like to add AI to RoboCo? And what could you do in RoboCo that wouldn't be practical in the real world? Well, we could do swarm AI, right? So
Mhm.
like AI where a bunch of different robot agents are communicating with one another in order to do something in coordination. It's
Mhm.
very difficult or impossible to do in the real world, just based on the practical limitations of how much each of those robots would cost and how much space you have and all that
Mhm.
kind of stuff. So I think it's basically the platforms, the mechanics, and the subject areas. And then in terms of our methodology, each project is a unique combination of a subject matter expert, a designer, and then a development team.
Mhm.
And because you have different designers have different methodologies and approaches to designing games. Different subjects or content areas sort of lend themselves to different types of mechanics. Like a game about accounting, is a very different play space than a game about being a nurse, for example. In the latter case, you have a lot of physically embodied learning objectives, and in the case of the former, you have, you're thinking about financial systems and how numbers interact with each other, and of course, it's very process based as well. So yeah, I think, just by virtue of working on a very eclectic mix of different projects with different team members, we're constantly inventing and reinventing. It's pretty rare that we lean heavily on game mechanics or tropes from entertainment-based game genres. And I know that is one of the challenges of designing educational games, but it's also one of the really enjoyable and satisfying things about it.
Right. Thanks, Dan. I really appreciate you disclosing the relationship that your designers and your development team shares with your subject matter experts. Just as a quick aside, how do you go about sourcing your subject matter experts? Do you find them? Do they volunteer? What's that process like?
Yeah, so for internal projects like RoboCo, where we are designing the IP from scratch, then yeah, we work with external subject matter experts. And then for a lot of our client work, where we're hired to develop a game on contract that's custom for a particular client, oftentimes the client will bring a subject matter expert to the table who either works for them or they've sourced as a third party. Or if that's not the case, then we will also work with them to source somebody. So yeah, we always like to, and then of course the designer themselves, I think, becomes, through the process of researching and preparing for the game design, will become something of a subject matter in and of themselves as well. And a different type of subject matter than somebody who has spent a career thinking about a particular subject, because the designer is thinking about it in the same way that a novice learner would think about it, which is actually puts them in a really good position to dialogue with somebody who knows the subject area in and out based on life experience, because those people sometimes struggle to see how to frame something in a way that would make sense to somebody who is not an expert.
Great. Thank you, Dan. Appreciate that. So thanks for joining us today. Where can people go to find out more about you?
So they can go to filamentgames.com. They can find out about RoboCo at roboco.com. That's RoboCo.co. I said com, but I meant co. RoboCo.co, filamentgames.com.
Great. Thanks, Dan. I'll also put all those links in the show description and show notes. So Dan, thanks again for joining us. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Dave.
I hope you found this episode useful. If you'd like to learn more, then a great place to start is my free course on gamification. You can sign up for it at universityxp.com/gamification. You can also get a full transcript of this episode, including links to references, in the description or show notes. Thanks for joining us. Again, I'm your host, Dave Eng from Games-Based Learning by University XP. On Experience Points, we explore different ways we can learn from games. If you like this episode, please consider commenting, sharing, and subscribing. Subscribing is absolutely free and ensures that you'll get the next episode of Experience Points delivered directly to you. I'd also love it if you took some time to rate the show. I live to lift others with learning, so if you found this episode useful, consider sharing it with someone who could also benefit. Also, make sure to visit University XP online at universityxp.com. University XP is also on Twitter at university_XP and on Facebook and LinkedIn as University XP. Also, feel free to email me anytime. My email address is dave@universityxp.com. Game on.